Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Steve Befort is a law professor at the University of Minnesota who specializes in employment law. Steve, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Over the past several decades, the number of union jobs and companies whose employees are represented by unions has been in decline. What's behind this trend?
Well, actually, the actual numbers of unionized workers has stayed relatively stable at about 16 to 17 million, but the proportion of the American workforce represented by unions, you're right, has declined tremendously from about 35% in the mid-1950s to today only about 12% of all American workers are represented by unions. You asked what was the cause? Well, that's hotly debated, but let me throw out three common suggestions. One is that the nature of what American workers do is different today than it used to be. Less manufacturing, less blue-collar jobs, more professional, technical service, and the traditional base of unionization was in blue-collar jobs. So that's one suggestion. A second is that we've got a global economy now, and competition is worldwide, and employers can move like manufacturing businesses to Mexico, China, other places, and that puts downward pressure on unionized businesses in the United States. And then third, and this is particularly unions make this claim, that management opposition to union organizing efforts is not dealt with under the National Labor Relations Act appropriately, that the NLRA is too weak to deter unlawful activities.
Do you expect this trend to continue, or will unions try and recruit new workers, for example, people in professions or in white-collar occupations?
The trend clearly has been downward, although the drop has slowed. Efforts by unions and Democratic allies to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, which would be a new way of organizing workplaces through card checks rather than elections. Many people think that could change the direction of labor, although that's unlikely to pass right now. Organizing new areas, well, it's tough to organize white-collar workers. Usually they're better paid and tend to be fairly mobile. Where the new organizing efforts are going is in low-paying service sector jobs. And there's been some success there, like the organizing janitors in larger cities has gained momentum. And also in workforces where there's many immigrant workers, that's been some success.
The National Labor Relations Act was signed into law during the 1930s. How did this act help resolve many of the issues between unions and management?
Sure. Prior to the 1930s, there were a lot of unions around, but they weren't protected by federal law. So employers who wanted to oppose unionizing efforts could actually fire or refuse to hire workers who sympathized with unions. They could refuse to bargain. And the National Labor Relations Act basically did three things. It protected individuals who wanted to organize or not into a union, so employers could not fire union supporters. It required that after a union had been selected by employees, that the employer was bound to bargain with the union. And then it protected the union membership's right to engage in concerted activities for mutual aid and protection, which mostly is strikes and boycotts.
In 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, overriding a veto by President Harry Truman. Taft-Hartley placed many restrictions on unions that were not part of the National Labor Relations Act. Unions obviously opposed Taft-Hartley, and attempts to repeal it over the years have failed. What did the act specifically prohibit unions from doing?
Well, it prohibited the secondary boycott, which is a major issue. A secondary boycott is if there's a strike against employer A, the union can go to employer B and try to get them to stop doing business with employer A. That's called a secondary boycott, and after the Taft-Hartley Act, that was no longer permissible. So that's one weapon that unions had was restricted. The Taft-Hartley Act also added some unfair labor practice limitations on union activity, and then it adopted the right to work laws, which if a state legislature votes to make their state a so-called right to work state, that would preclude unions from collecting dues from non-members, and that weakens their resources quite a bit.
Generally speaking, if a company is unionized, all of the workers who fall under the union's jurisdiction must belong to that union. But that's not always the case. Tell us about the difference between a so-called closed shop and an open shop.
If a union is certified to represent the workers, the union has a duty to represent everybody in the workplace. But not everybody has to become a member of the union. In a state such as Minnesota, which is not a right-to-work state, the union can assess dues against, or fees, I guess, against non-members for cost of representation and bargaining, but not full union dues. In right-to-work states, and there's about 20 of them in the United States, mostly in the South and West, unions cannot collect dues or fees at all from non-members.
Let's talk more about the right-to-work laws. How do those laws impact the abilities of unions to organize and compel workers to join the union?
Well, it's no accident that the 20 states that have right-to-work laws are also far less unionized than the other 30 states that don't have right-to-work laws. If only dues can be collected from members, the union still has a duty to represent everybody, but they can't collect fees from those who are non-members. So the union has less resources. There is more incentive, if you will, for employees to not be members because they can save a lot of money but still get the services. And it just adds up to far more difficulty to organize workers in those states.
When Access Minnesota returns, more of our conversation with University of Minnesota law professor Steve Befort.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
And now more of our conversation with University of Minnesota law professor Steve Befort. The relationship between unions and the companies whose employees they represent can often be quite rocky. But there are some examples of unions and employers collaborating on various projects. One of which comes to mind immediately is at the Ford plant in St. Paul, where the United Auto Workers and Ford have collaborated on a training program. How common are these collaborations and how successful are they?
Well, I think they may be more common than you might think. Yeah, there's a certain amount of adversarial nature between management and labor, but particularly in industries where survival of the business is important to both parties, and automobile industry is certainly that. There have been many cooperative ventures that have been set up to try and make win-win situations. And that's particularly true in the public sector, where government often acts less adversarially with unions because the money profit margin is not on the table. So in tough times, there's, as I said, more cooperation than I think might meet the eye.
In the early 1980s, the Reagan administration directed the Federal Aviation Administration to fire striking air traffic controllers. This action effectively busted the traffic controllers union, PATCO. How can companies or government agencies legally fire striking workers?
If they're covered by the National Labor Relations Act, the answer is they cannot. In the PATCO situation, it was a little bit different. The air traffic controllers employees were federal employees. They had no right to strike under federal law. And so the strike that they undertook was illegal, and the federal government had every right to, under federal law, to fire them. But in the situation for private employment and in some public sector jurisdictions like Minnesota, employees can legally strike. They're protected. They can't be fired, but they can be replaced.
The recent one-day nurses' strike in Minneapolis being an example where hospitals hired temporary workers to replace the striking nurses. How common is it to bring in replacement workers, and what's the difference between a temporary and a permanent replacement worker?
One thing to understand as background is that there are two types of replacement workers. An employer can hire temporary replacements and have those workers do the job of the strikers until the strike is over and then the strikers return. That had been the norm up until the PATCO strike. And that's what happened in the local nurses strike, was just temporary workers. But increasingly since 1980, employers have hired permanent replacements where they promise long-term employment. And the permanent replacements, that's not firing the strikers, but the strikers, when the strike is over, only get their jobs back as openings result in the future.
One of the criticisms of the collective bargaining process is that it robs workers of their rights to negotiate individually with employers. But my understanding is in many collective bargaining agreements, the contract establishes minimum rates of pay, so there's really nothing to prevent an individual worker from going to management to try and negotiate a higher rate of pay than what is required in the contract. Is that true? Tell us more about that process.
Well, yeah, there is. The employer has a duty to bargain with the union for its representatives, and it has a duty not to bargain outside of the union. So the employer cannot go to individual employees and cut side deals. But what it can do, and this happens frequently, is that employers and unions sit down and negotiate deals that provides greater pay for certain job classes. And in professional baseball, for example, they cut a deal that says where the union and employer agree that the employer can go to individual employees and negotiate separate contracts. But the long and short of it is, yes, there is some diminishment of individual rights in that the collective bargaining has to go either through the union or with the permission of the union.
And from your perspective, are relations between unions and management improving, deteriorating, or remaining about the same?
I think it varies by sector, by industry, and by workplace. In tough times like we're talking about with the automobile industries, I think we've seen some companies and unions try to hold hands to find common solutions. In the public sector, there's been a lot of work to try and find common solutions, such as reduced hours rather than layoffs. But I'd have to say, if anything, probably tensions have grown over the years as global competition has made companies, well, rewards companies more for being union-free, if you will, and unions try to struggle to either organize or maintain their status in the workplace.
Steve Befort, professor of law at the University of Minnesota, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
You're welcome. It's glad to be here.
That's all for this month's Access Minnesota. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.